Hey everybody, it is Matt Weaver here with Roy Troyer, and we're going to discuss the subject of really nationalism versus globalism in so much in a biblical way that it's connected to the idea of Babel or Babylon. So, Roy Troyer, kick it off for us this morning.
Alrighty. Um, yeah, I guess what I have in mind is probably going to encompass a little bit more than globalism and nationalism, but there's a principle behind it that applies across probably a couple different spectrums or maybe even more.
Hmm.
Um, but, basically nowadays we see, I'll start off in the secular realm. We see, I guess, nowadays a certain degree of backlash that's kind of formed against nationalism in some sectors. Obviously, there's still a lot of strong support for it in other sectors, but um, the backlash I would say that we do see came or is coming from probably the extremes, that we've seen of nationalism in the past, which can include ruthless imperialism and racism and things like that. And I would say that a lot of that came in the wake of probably World War II. Um, Arguably, World War II might have been the zenith or culmination of all that was evil in imperialism and nationalism. And I guess it seems like a lot of people just kind of had enough of it at that point. So this after World War II or in the wake of it, this is where we see um, international courts forming and the United Nations, and shortly after that, the World Health Organization. And before this, the idea of international law, basically, if I'm seeing it correctly, basically didn't exist. But at this point, there was the basic formations of what we see as recognizable international law. And it seems that over the years, rather than slowing down, it's probably crystallized into what I would call a full blown globalist movement, where some people want to continually minimize national sovereignty and, the divisions of cultures at all and create a new multicultural order of things on a more global level. And it seems like the push for unity is in any context that might be popular at the time, any popular ideologies or none at all. And I guess what I'm getting at is it's just unity for unity's for the sake of it. So that's on the secular side. Um, and after I'd sent you my proposal for the subject that we have here, I was spinning it through my mind, and of course, we have the parallel in the church realm. And a lot of times, we're going to see that you have something perhaps God is doing, and then you have something that the enemy is counterfeiting. Maybe that's what's going on. I don't know, but I'll bring it to bear, and we can flesh it out and discuss it, I guess. But that's what I see in the secular realm. In the church, we're living in an era where we're also seeing major backlash, and I would say in this case, it's probably against the past 500 years or so of denominational divisions, opinions, extremes. And, the way our divisions started was probably a good thing. It was, the fragmentation of man made, iron fisted unity in the form of the Catholic Church. And as soon as Catholicism's hold was broken, so was any sense of cohesion and unity in the church at large. Um, for better or for worse, we weren't united anymore at that point. And I feel like this worked, and it was probably a good thing at the time because of what needed to be broken. And I feel like, it worked for a while as people found the various groups they felt they belonged to and kind of settled in. But, as time went on, obviously, everybody nowadays is aware of kind of what happened. People settled into denominational affiliations and they kind of put up walls and became sometimes slightly, sometimes more combative against others who didn't believe exactly the way they did. So yeah, I would say this also reached a breaking point sometime in the 20th century with people, slowly breaking down denominational barriers and finding common ground with people that have varying convictions. And this accelerated over time, of course, to where a lot of what we see nowadays is more non-denominational, or even the people who still have denominational affiliations do not hold very strongly to them. So I guess what I'm saying, in both arenas, there's a push for unity, solidarity, crushing of divisions. And yeah, I just want to talk about this movement and see if there is such a thing as too much unity or unity in the wrong context. Or, I guess, if unity is always good to any degree and under any context, and if there's any difference between the unity we're seeing forming globally and the unity we're seeing forming in the church. So that kind of sets the stage for what I want to talk about. I have some scriptures that I'll get into later, but um, that I'll let you interject a little bit before I keep moving here.
Well, it is a broad subject. It is a complicated subject, and it's if you look at, I guess, the trajectory of history, right? It's really the core of the subject is civilization. So if you look at how civilizations formed, based on secular history, we have Sumerian really being the first, and then from there it extends outward. And in short, civilization is enabled when a group of people come together and have a collected or a collective law code that everyone abides by, or some kind of hierarchy or power structure that they are agreed to live under. And that group now lives together. And the advantage of living together in a group is that you have shared energies, productivity, things of that nature. And in the biblical stories, what we read to begin with is, you're dealing with families. You have families that are living together, and all of a sudden, this one kind of branches off and starts doing his own thing, and that one does his own thing, and that one. And you read that kind of in Genesis, with the sons of Cain, for instance, and Cain himself kind of seeming to separate a bit from the family and kind of going his own way. And ultimately, evil is prevalent in whatever structure there was, and the result of that is God destroying what that was. And I don't think it was just because of the humans. I think that there was probably the whole Genesis 6 thing. There's probably trouble going on in the heavenlies as well, where you have these divine beings and these hybrids and everything else going on. That's enough. The Bible doesn't give us a lot of information. Probably good that it doesn't, because it was probably pretty horrific. But with all of that said, when he restructures the world with Noah, it's actually in Jewish tradition. I'm not saying it's 100% the truth, but it's interesting in Jewish tradition that one of the things God instructs Noah to give is what they call the Noahide laws. And the Noahide laws, one of the differences of, it basically, it's like, imagine like a Ten Commandments, but it's not really the Ten Commandments. It's kind of a precursor to that. And there's all kinds of conspiracies around the Noahides. There's people that believe the Jews are going to control the world and apply the Noahide laws to everybody, and all Christians are going to die because they believe in the Trinity, and that's idolatry. If you in the light of the Noahide laws, it's it's ridiculous. Honestly, there's a very small sect of ultra Orthodox Jews that really holds to that needing to be necessary. So it'd be kind of like saying the Amish are going to rule the world and they're going to apply the oddening with to everybody in the world, and you're going to have to. It's just
Right.
not. It's not really in the realm of reality. But for some people, this is real. But in short, um, the let me just look it up real quick here. So you're not supposed to eat the flesh of a living animal. You're not supposed to steal. You're not supposed to murder. Not supposed to commit adultery. No idolatry. No cursing of God. And then you're supposed to have courts of justice. Um, basically in the world, and those are the main Noahide laws. And I mean, I don't think that's that dramatic. Like as far as most
Right.
Christians would be like, well, that's okay. That's actually, as I understand it, a little bit what was behind the Acts 15. Like you can see a thread of that coming through with the Acts 15 discussion about Gentiles. So that, basically reiterates that. Doesn't have the basics of murder and stuff in there, but it does say the whole sexual morality, eating flesh of idols or offered to idols and stuff like that. Anyway, so you have these kind of structures, and if I remember right, it was what was one of the old the Sumerian kings. One of the first ones, there was a stela that they found that had laws written on it. It was one of the first that they known that civilization had a law code, and it was a basic eye for an eye kind of law code that if you take this from your neighbor, it will be taken from you. If you do this to your neighbor, it will be done to you. So kind of a cause and consequence around how people treat each other. But in short, after the flood, there's a time where I think it's Genesis 10, if I have my memory right, where that gives a table, the genealogies, and it's either 10 or 11 where it then talks about that the sons of men are dispersed upon the face of the earth. It just spreads them out. And and then it says in the days of Peleg that the earth was divided. Now, doesn't really say exactly what that is, but in the book of Jubilees, which again, it's apocryphal, I don't even know that it's apocryphal, it's probably beyond that, but it isn't. But in there, it does describe that the division of the nations happened at that time. And it does coincide with what is happening in Genesis, that you have this like partitioning happening. You have the mention of the sons of Noah, and uh, I think as a whole, there's biblically speaking, I think there's 70 nations, if I'm correct. Again, I'm just going off of memory. So, but in short, you read that in Genesis 10 and 11, and so this is this dividing of it seems like it's a dividing of territories. And with the dividing of territories, now each family unit kind of has its own structure, has its own hierarchy. I mean, you'll have your own patriarch, and that patriarch's going to do things his way. And that's kind of the basis for the world where the Bible begins. When God calls Abraham out, he's calling him out of the Sumerian kingdom, which was the first organized civilization. And he says, you know, come into a land that I will show you, that I will give to you, and that the context is the dividing of the nations. And he's like, I will give this to you forever, and I will show you my way. And there's later in Deuteronomy, I believe it's 32, if I have it right. There's this a little bit of a discrepancy between the Masoretic and like the Septuagint. And let me just look it up quick. I think it's Deuteronomy 28. Let me look.
Are you
Um,
talking about where it also talks about the dividing of nations?
find it here. If I easier to read. Not the 28. No, it's not 28. What is it?
I think it is 32, or that's a verse that
32.
I had in mind anyway. If you had the same one
People,
in
yeah.
mind, I'm not sure.
But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob. Okay, so this is Deuteronomy 32, verses 8. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, and when he divided mankind, and this is where the complexity comes in. Okay, the Masoretic renders it one way, and the Septuagint renders it a different way. He fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. So this is ESV, which would have been a majority text translation, versus KJV. You're going to see he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. So which is it?
Yeah. I mean, the
Um,
children of Israel are pretty numerous, so I don't
and then
know.
to make it even more complex, you can read the net, and it renders it according to the number of the heavenly assembly, which would be, well, I guess that does match this whole sons of God thing. But here's the
Right.
thing. If that's the case, and we read in Genesis 10, I believe, let me just get it right. Descended from Noah. Yes, it gives all the sons. Those are basically the earthly representatives. And then you have Babel in 11. Um, but the whole Deuteronomy, what that basically puts forth, and where I heard it first was Dr. Heiser in his book, The Unseen Realm. Uh, this whole reality of this, the messaging that is like God disinherited the nations, kind of like he was God, and then he was kind of like divided them up according to the sons of God. It's almost like he gave up on that. And then you
Hmm.
see the narrative in Genesis from the division, chapter 10. Immediately you have the Tower of Babel incident that happens in 11, and from that he drives people across the face of the earth. And just after that he calls Abram. So it's there is this message of there was a collective people I mean, he had destroyed the old world because of corruption. The family, it's now one family, and it's a righteous family. In God's eyes, Noah was perfect in his ways. And he takes a righteous family and brings them in, and they're only a few generations in, and already it's like not working.
Right.
It's not working. And you have the Babel incident. He divides and says, "No, you're not going to consolidate your power and strength." According to Babel, you're going to be spread out over the earth. And he confuses the languages, and they head out over. He divides them up, and that seems to be the messaging going on. And so then in 11 or in 12, you immediately go from this whatever the Tower of Babel incident was, which to me was, what was the Tower of Babel? Lots of thought along what it is, but it's in its basic form, it's a ziggurat. It's a cosmic mountain. So they would have had in the ancient world an understanding that the gods live in the mountains, if you will, and they wanted to create their own God mountain. And as I understand it, I mean, you look at the pyramid, for instance. Pyramids are the earliest structures that humans built. The Great Pyramid at Giza was there before Abraham. So it was, for whatever reason, you have pyramid building happening earliest points in civilization, and they found bases for these ziggurats over in that area. Ur of the Chaldees itself has a famous ziggurat, a big one. And then in that area, it was a ziggurat. Ziggurat building was the thing. Let's just put it that way. And ziggurats are these step structures, or pyramidal structures, that are built. And people are kind of struggling to understand why, but all of them are connected to gods and things of that nature. I mean, some people speculated their tombs could be, but anyway, there's this thing going on with pyramids, and the first one seems to be the one that is happening here. This great pyramid at Babel, which they call Babel, is just because they don't understand the languages, but it then becomes Babelion, which is Gate of the Gods. So
Hmm.
there's an interesting connection going on there between what were the ancient peoples doing, what caused God to divide it, and it has to do, at least in this time frame, that the consolidation was a highly negative thing because of the intent, what they were trying to do. They were building this thing for whatever reason. And there's all kinds of speculation. Was it a alien machine and yada yada, Stargate? I'm not getting into that. That's not what we're necessarily talking about. But it is interesting that they are consolidated around this one principle, this one idea, this one project. It unifies everybody, and God comes and sees what they're doing, and he's like, this is not good. So he disperses them. And then he really see the whole biblical story develop out of following Abraham. Abraham believes God, God gives him a covenant, promises his descendants will be blessed, and then all the families of the earth will be blessed through him. So there's this dispensing of blessing that God wants to do to the world through Abraham that he doesn't choose to do through anybody else. And it seems to be connected that Abraham didn't believe in a multitude of gods, that he believed in a singular one. And the fact is, back in the early days, to believe in that close to the flood, to believe in different gods like that, seems to be connected to the whole Deuteronomy 32 reality that you have regional entities. You have, if it's sons of God, B'nai Elohim, it's this is the Watcher theory, if you will, where God has princes over territories, and there's like a heavenly reality to a nation. We could call that an ideology, and it's connected to the manifestation of earth. So we read in Daniel famously that he's resisted. Gabriel's trying to get a message to Daniel, but he's resisted by the prince of the region, the one who stands in the way is a spiritual entity, and he needs the help of Michael to overcome the obstacle and to get through. So it gives us an idea that there's a supernatural reality to nations. It's not just a physical thing. It's not just a
Right.
um yeah, for whatever reason in God's understanding of things, it seemed that when he divided the nations according to these divine beings, and I'm not saying these are all good divine beings, and they're just
Right.
more powerful than us. They're probably fallen, or I don't know. Okay, it seems like they're fallen because what happens is many of these nations start worshiping their uh what's the word I'm looking for? Their patron. Their divine patron. They start worshiping these divine patrons, and these divine patrons are in conflict with each other over territory for the rest of human history.
Hmm.
And whether you connect it to that or not, it certainly seems to be the case because when you look at the ridiculous excuses used to start wars and kill people, it certainly doesn't justify the outcome. But it was a way the world operated. Like you had this influence, this ideology that would overcome a people group, and they would march out with that ideology, trying to force the whole world to conform to it, and then be hit with other ideologies and civilizations, and they would fight. And we've had warfare in human history ever since the beginning. And
Hmm.
it's motivated by illogical forces. Like it just isn't logical at times that why we have it, but we have it. So
Right.
God sets this up. My view of it is that in a supernatural way, where you have these supernatural entities over the nations, and the nations are now subject to what the patron decides to allow in his domain. And then you have God choosing Abram, setting up his own kingdom, setting up his own prince, Michael being that prince who is the one who watches over Israel. Ultimately, the Messiah being revealed through Israel for the salvation of the world, that all would come out of the nations and believe in the one and true God and his uh, king in his Lord, and the reclamation of those nations taking place. So I do hold to that kind of a view. Now I'll stop because I've talked long enough, but that is my basic, that is how I would like, that's how I contextually approach the issue from a biblical standpoint. From a physical standpoint, yeah, you're just looking at people groups fighting over dumb stuff because people do dumb stuff, and and you have rational thinking and rule of law to try to temper human um, ideas and things of that nature. Because like right now, I mean, you have the Middle East conflict. There's no rationale for it. It makes no sense. Like why does Gaza keep fighting? what
Right.
what benefit is there for them to just keep fighting? They've been decimated. They still fight. They still fighting.
And
Why?
the zeal
Like,
they have for it
but
is
just, I mean, they could yield to the will of Israel and have a very good life. But
Right.
no, there's an ideology controlling the people. That's what I'm saying. There's an entity, and they're subject to the entity. If you buy into an ideology, then you buy into this position, and then you're, and it's no different in America than it is in Europe. All these countries have these master ideologies that kind of control them. I think goes back to Deuteronomy 32. You can't get away from it, because it's the only way it's rational. It's like you can't make sense of what everyone's thinking. I mean, war is completely illogical. I mean, it makes no sense. What? Why? Why? Like even Lebanon. Why attack Israel? Like why? Like you're not going to win,
Right.
you know? But
Yeah, they would consider themselves martyrs for their cause then.
well, there I go. Ideology,
Right.
and the
Yeah.
Arab nations as a whole back in 67, 48, attacking. Same thing with Russia, Ukraine. Like, okay, that might be a bit of a rabbit hole. But in short, you still have a power who just decides to take up arms, and nobody knows exactly the reason because the person who made the decision hasn't completely told us why he did it. He does, publicly blames it on NATO, publicly blames it on um, Ukraine being historically part of the Russian Empire, not the USSR. A
Right.
lot of people get that wrong, but it's an empire territory that was removed during the USSR and they want it back. But in short, it's still there's an ideology. We are owed this land. This is our land, and they're willing to go out and to kill hundreds of thousands of people for the right to control that land.
Hmm.
It's not rational. But
Right. And it
all
seems
right,
like
I digress. I yield.
so yeah, I mean, you're right. It certainly is. It seems irrational if you look throughout history, and but you also see, even if you read the Bible, that God uses these conflicts for his own advantage, to chasten nations and things like that. But then, if one nation becomes too zealous in performing what he's asked them to, basically in chastening another nation, then he chastens them back, and it's just this whole back and forth, and seems like a whole mess. But somehow it seems like God prefers that structure over the unified cohesion of evil, which almost seems has synergistic power, which basically would mean a multiplied effect of the power of evil that seems to come out of people that are unified around it. And even before he disinherited the nations, it seems that he wanted divisions. And let me see here. I have in Genesis 9, first verse, um, he says, "And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." So there you already have an example of God wanting them to spread out and fill the earth and not necessarily stay in one place. And he kind of reiterates it in verse 7. But by Genesis 11, we see that the people were obeying half of this, but not necessarily the other half. They were definitely multiplying, but they weren't filling the earth. And you kind of went over the Babel thing, but in chapter 10 of Genesis, trying to see which verses I had in mind here, 8 through 11, I think. See if I can find it here. We see the rise of Nimrod. Says in chapter 10, verse 8, Now Cush was the father of Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before Yahweh. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before Yahweh. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel. So he's the one behind Babel, and he basically, and then it goes on and lists more nations and cities that he created. But it seems that he basically the one who invents the whole construct of kingdoms. And, I probably would come down on the side of nationalism over globalism. Just because, even though we see the excesses of nationalism in the past, it seems that God prefers that to the consolidation of evil power and imagination. But it seems that even before nationalism, that God may have had even a more fragmented plan than that, which it seems like people more or less were operating in family groups and clans, and maybe you could call them tribes. But they went from that to the Tower of Babel, and you could say that that was more or less a replication of a more global system. I'll just go ahead and read the account here. Now it's in chapter 11 of Genesis. Now the whole earth had the same language, the same words, and it happened as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. Then they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone, and they had tar for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city, and a tower whose top will reach into heaven, and let us make for ourselves a name, lest we be scattered over the face of the earth." Then Yahweh came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And Yahweh said, "Behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language, and this is what they have begun to do. So now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them." And it goes on to talk about how he scattered them for that reason. And it just seems that, notice in verse 6 where God says nothing they purpose to do will be impossible for them. It seems like that might be the crux of the whole reason why God wants people spread out, and that maybe progress isn't necessarily all it's cracked up to be. I would say, unity in the context of evil will multiply evil, and unity in the context of good will multiply good. And even, I had to think that in Israel, even after they came to a certain size and power after Solomon's reign, God even split them up. So it's all interesting, and you know, unity is great in the right context. But I guess I would hold that perhaps there's a wrong context for it, and that it's very, very hard to find that right context in the earth in which we live. Perhaps the one example we see of unity on a large scale really working well was in Acts after Pentecost. And perhaps it takes an outpouring of the Holy Spirit on a large scale before God can trust people with complete unity. And I guess what we're seeing today is that both, or the potential of both, are at play. We see in the secular realm, we see globalism coming into play, where people are consolidating power on a global scale. And, in the church, we also see unification. And, there's various reasons why this is happening, but probably, like I said, part of it is the backlash. And then another reason I would say that it's happening is obviously the technology we have enables it to a far greater extent than it's ever been possible before. Mostly what I would point to is the internet, and then following the advent of internet, we have social media, which connects people like never before. And I find it interesting, language barriers are being broken pretty much at a record pace, um, which, you see Babel, you see what God did there. And now we kind of are actually seeing a reversal of it. around, from according to what I've read, around 3,000 out of the 7,000 languages in the world are considered in danger of being lost currently. Um, and that to me seems to be an unraveling of what we saw in Babel. Um, but let me find where I wanted to go next here. Maybe I'll just stop talking there and let you interject, and then I'll pick up from that point.
Well, I think the classical maybe approach from a like our classic argument for globalism versus nationalism is the fact that this reunifying is potentially unhealthy, that there's the tear down of culture and things of that nature. And it could be, however, it does seem like for whatever reason, according to the Bible, that it ultimately doesn't succeed because the last days there are still nations represented. It talks about all nations coming up against Jerusalem. Um, so I don't know necessarily, like from my point of view, that it's a biblical threat for there to be a cessation of nations. A lot of people have come to believe that it's some kind of, or that there'll be a consolidation because the description of the Antichrist and people coming under his kingdom, there's this kind of 1980s Hal Lindsey approach to eschatology where it was like the one world government, the one world government, and they that was like the big thing is the one world government. The UN was one world government, and it does appear like there's going to be tremendous influence. The Antichrist will have tremendous influence, but nations are still represented for whatever it's worth. It could absolutely be that there is a head organization like the UN which takes over global governance that still allows states to be states as far as nations to be nations, but it holds the keys because it's kind of already doing that. The EU
Right,
does that, the US does that, the federal government does that over the states, and the UN is kind of the government of the governments. And I mean, one could argue that there's already that structure in place if the Antichrist gets into the UN. However, I don't view it as much as I mean there's two elements going on there. If globalism like globalism could be the answer to okay, hypothetically, it could be the answer to the end of ideologies, right? Because if you end all the radical ideologies, you'll have peace. If the world is one family and we have ways to solve our differences, then you'll have peace. Well, that's a seems like a good thing, right? The only reason to hold on to nationalism is basically for negotiating. You know, if you can negotiate it from a position of strength, a better position for your people. And people like kind of they don't like one global, ideology. People like have their own ideologies. So, and we feel like governments threaten, like for us as Christians, would threaten our ideology and the way our worldview sees things. And so, we look to a government to provide us safety to for our beliefs. So in short, I think like nationalism, the challenge of nationalism is what inspires it, what's behind it, what's operating it, like where does the ideology come from? And the challenge of globalism is, well, who is the king? Where does the
right.
power come from? Who runs it? And I feel like both are flawed. I think both systems are dangerous. And the one type of law system that seems to work the best is a constitutional system where the rights of individuals are not infringed upon. Like that's the part of our system that's good. We at least have some rights. But in general, governments have always been like a factor, and ideologies have been a factor. Like I mean, what do we use as an example? I mean, Saudi Arabia, that's basically a theocracy, if you will. They have their way of thinking and their way of doing things. And if you live in that country, you got to deal with that, versus Jordan. Jordan's also technically considered like a theocracy, although they have a parliament. So there's a little bit more liberty. And Egypt's that way. Strong man, but they have a parliament. So some of these countries, like, they all have kind of their own operating principle which to me seems to be related to what's overseeing them. In Paul's view, he does not tear down the structure of principalities and powers being in control. He affirms that's still a reality. So, from a nationalistic standpoint, hyper-nationalism is almost idolatry from my worldview because you are worshiping an entity that is manifesting through the ideology of the country. On the other side of it, globalism, without the actual King of Kings, globalism is also idolatry. It's you worshiping the idea that one system can answer everything. It's no,
Right.
like both sides are bad. Both sides don't work. Both sides lead to
Well, if you're
bloodshed,
an
murder,
idealist, then
and
yeah,
power
you
and
can't
control.
really find you can't find the right solution. And I think God sets it up that way for a reason, right?
It seems
You
so.
know, that yeah. But, I would, for the reason that God having his own eyes set on a global government, um, I guess that's why I would also kind of to some degree, not only for that reason, but I would kind of see that the enemy has his eyes on a counterfeit global government as well. And yes, I do think that probably there will still be divisions of nations, and yet will they just be vassal nations? The UN doesn't have a lot of power right now, and we're still more or less a nationalistic or nationalist setup throughout the world. And basically, whoever has the strongest military still can break out of whatever hold the UN has. Um, I don't know if we want to get into the end times Babylon situation. I read into some of that, and I thought, me reading it, that there is perhaps a structure in place that's predate that, you see in scripture how Paul says that the antichrist, there's a singular antichrist coming, but we see many antichrists as well, even now. And perhaps my thinking was that even though perhaps there's an ultimate Babel and an ultimate Babylon coming, that we are also seeing a system throughout history that is manifesting itself in a maybe a more non-literal way, sometimes maybe in a literal way. And let me see if I can find some of these verses I was looking at. And you're free to disagree with me. This is just my musing. Um, so I'll start in Revelation 17. The first verse says, "Then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and said to me, 'Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters.'" The great prostitute being Babylon. I won't go
That's your
through.
theory, or you think that is the great like
Oh,
your operating
I thought that.
principle?
No, I didn't know
Mystery
that was up for
Babylon, you're
debate.
saying?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's what it's referring to, right?
I'm just clarifying how you see it. No, it's fine. Keep
No,
going.
that's what I thought. I didn't.
Yep.
That wasn't part of what I thought might be up for debate, but maybe it is. Because
No,
later
I'm just
on,
clarifying.
yeah. So I would say that that is Babylon, but maybe
Hmm.
not. Anyway, so moving on. My only point in that verse was that she's seated in many waters, and then moving on to verse 9 through 10 says this preceding this he lays out the beast and all the heads and how they represent kingdoms and so on. Maybe I should just read the whole thing.
Go for
I'll
it.
go to verse 2 here then. "With whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on earth have become drunk. And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup of abominations and the impurities of her sexual immorality. And on her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great. And this is where I would have come to the conclusion that, you know, what's what it's talking about in verse 1 is, and of earth's abominations. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. When I saw her, I marveled greatly. But the angel said to me, why do you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her. The beast that you saw was and is not, and is about to rise from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. And the dwellers on earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, will marvel to see the beast, because it was and is not and is to come. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. They are also 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen. One is, the other has not yet come. And when he does come, he must remain only a little while. So, what we're seeing, what I wanted to get to was 9 and 10, which was the last little segment there. So she's seated on 7 heads, which are 7 mountains, which are also 7 kings. And, throughout history, those kings, those empires have cropped up and fallen. And during the time of this writing, it says one is, that would have been obviously the Roman Empire at that time. I guess my point is that this mystery of Babylon was at work in all of these empires, the way it sounds, since she's seated on all of them, and was even operating in Rome at the time. And then obviously one is to come, and that would be whatever, we don't know what that is yet. Everybody has different theories on it, but I guess my whole point is that she's operating in many different places and many different empires and in many different ways. Um, so Revelation 18:24 was the next one I wanted to get to. And in her was found the blood of prophets and saints and of all who have been slain on the earth. Another indication that she's been at work throughout the history of the world, all who have been slain on the earth. And there's many verses also that a lot of people can point to that'll tell us that Babylon is going to be a literal place and a literal city and all of that. And I'm very open to that. I guess my only point is that there also seems to be an overarching structure, excuse me, that's been in place through history, probably still is in place today, and will culminate into its fullness in the last days. I guess that's my point. You're free to give me your thoughts, your rebuttals, or whatever you might have.
Fight, 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 fight. Um, well, I mean, obviously Revelation is a highly controversial
Right. I know.
book. So, I don't know that it's not really about, let's put it this way. Okay, so Mystery Babylon is an interesting thing, and every generation has had kind of a different iteration of what they think it is. Um, you know, so anyway, there's been iterations, and maybe that's natural. People try to apply something to the generation they're in, so that if something does come to pass, they understand it. The messaging seems to be along the lines of an entity, again, an entity behind this network. Let's put it that way. And in that entity is where you see the blood of the prophets, the immorality, the disgusting things, etc. And for a lot of people, what is the woman? Well, the woman it's most likely, in my opinion, is representing the Queen of Heaven, which is a symbol that goes back all the way through all the cultures, back even to Samaria. And it is Inanna, also known as Ishtar, also known as, oh, let me think of all the different ones. Isis in the Egyptian culture, Diana in, was that either Greek or Rome? And anyway, this is this female deity and this entity. And it seems like there again, that's why I'm saying a lot of the ideologies are connected to beings, and Revelation does describe that. The same with the dragon. The dragon is also an entity who's got, the heads and the horns. Um, and I'm trying to think. The other one was the beast that had the seven heads, or was that eight? Five of which are fallen.
In Revelation, there's seven heads at one point, and then later on a little bit he says there's eight, but it's same or it goes it accompanies the seven or something like that. So essentially, there's
10
seven.
horns, eight, seven heads, 10 horns, or eight heads. Yeah, okay. I have to
Yeah,
read the
it's
counting and
seven
get all that
heads and ten
straight.
horns. Yeah,
But in short, you have this beast and you have this woman, and this is a motif that goes all the way back through ancient history. Even in the Sumerian, you have Enlil and Inanna. This is this male female kind of thing going on. And I think that's somewhat connected to what John is seeing, is that behind many of the movements within, even Nash, I wouldn't even call it globalism. I mean, it has a source point, yes, but they, for whatever reason, love playing with these different nationalities and causing conflict. Like, why do all these nations have a similar figure in their culture, yet they consider themselves different than the other? Like they're compatible creatures, like in their pantheon, compatible deities, I should say. Yet they're different ideologies, and so I don't understand that all. It seems like we in the Christian world have simplified the realm of darkness to the point of there's Satan and his minions, and we don't get more descriptive than that. We say
right.
Satan and demons. That's the way we like to just cleanly, call the world realm of darkness. But it seems to be highly complex. It seems to be a lot more complex than that. It seems to be as complex as the socio realities of humanity. And so with that, you have these visions of these entities and this, and the whole the beast with the heads. I mean, you have similar things in Daniel where you've got four beasts coming out of the sea. One of those beasts has 10 horns. There's this language of entities. Let's just summarize it that way. Language of entities that are controlling these things. Like if you look at Daniel's four beasts rising out of the sea, Daniel 2, there's this division of nations represented in the statue. The head is one thing, the arms are one thing, the torso is one thing, the legs is another.
Right.
And it doesn't give a description of what those are. People assume it's well, his empire is up top, the head of gold, and then the Medo-Persia because of the arms, and then the legs of iron. That's got to be Rome. Well, it doesn't actually describe it. It doesn't say what it is. Some people then say, well, it's not Rome, it's the Islamic Caliphate. I think it's besides the point. I think that what it's trying to represent is there's going to be four dominant powers in the last days. Four beasts rise out of the sea, four dominant powers. You see that with the four heads of Daniel. It's a reoccurring theme. Let's put it that way. It's a reoccurring theme that the power structure in the world is based in these divisions. And ultimately it's connected to the beast who's got, the multiple heads. And the multiple heads is his influence down through different governments or civilizations. So
Through history.
you can go down through the nations that have been and are not anymore, and all of these are connected to one entity. And at the end, the eighth is of the seventh.
Hmm.
It's again, it's of the same thing. It's just different. It's manifested differently. So again, nations manifest this way. And that's where my belief is in ultimately, if you hold to the biblical view, if it's really biblical, I mean, we know Jesus is King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and he will come back, and the manifestation of him will bring into subjection all the ideologies and all the conflict because he will have at that point put in prison every entity that has rebelled. And then he will bring in subjection all the nations of the world. All nations will bend and bow and say, "You are Lord, you are the King." So there is going to be unification. It's fair to say that the ultimate leader of the realm of darkness, Hillel, I think it would probably be Hillel ben Shachar or Lucifer, that he is going to take a play to thwart the plan and put himself on that throne, put himself on that seat.
Hmm.
But again, you're dealing with a multiplicity of you're not dealing with a global singular government. I don't think that even the Bible represents it that way. His power is global. And I mean, you look at now, I mean, just look at us, for instance. Is the U.S. righteous or are we unrighteous? Are we God ordained or are we not God ordained? Or who are we a Christian country or aren't we a Christian country? All these debates happen and we can't really clearly answer. We there's things we do that seem to be good and there's things we do that seem to be very bad.
Hmm.
Like really bad, like really bad. And it's like, well, who is in control?
Yeah.
Is it righteous or well then we'd like to blame corruption, government corruption. It's government corruption. But what's behind it? If what's behind it is corrupt, then it's not a surprise that governments are corrupt because well what the entity controlling the government's corrupt. So of course it's going to be corruption. Like there's no surprise there. I think some people, and this is just again my view is like nations, it's impossible for there to be quote unquote Christian nations. Not because the people in them aren't Christians or that they would have had foundational laws that are more lenient towards a Western, the Western countries are more Christian in their thought process. But even that, the dominant force behind Western culture was the Catholic Church, which was a remnant of the Roman Empire. So if you're talking like head, 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 our thinking is very empirical in that sense. And we think the kingdom is empirical. I think a lot of people tend to look at the kingdom as very much in that epitome of, you know, empire. And they think kingdom living is empire, building things and stuff on behalf of the empire. We are representatives of the empire. And so they think very much that way in the kingdom mindset that I see in a lot of people is very much derived from the empire building, colonial, let's put it that way, the colonial thought processes of, I will raise my stake and this is now mine. And I'm not saying it's all wrong. I mean, we can do that in the Lord's sense, but his government is not of this world. His authority is not of this world.
Right.
That was his whole premise when he was in front of the Sanhedrin. They wanted him to submit, and he was like, I am not given this from you. This comes from God. So when he comes, it is complete overthrow. Not one nation is considered righteous at his coming. He judges Israel and he judges all the nations. So, like, I don't believe like that he now comes back and oh you America you get a pass because you are a Christian nation, England you get a pass because you're a Christian nation, or France you get a pass because you're a Christian nation, I controlled you. I don't think that's the story. I think
Perhaps
the
in
I
seasons.
think I think the what you we could say is that the culture would have ideals that would represent elements of Christianity, for instance, um, but that the nation itself is a extension of the kingdom in an empirical sense. I don't think it's possible.
No.
Um,
Not in that sense.
yeah, I know you and I have had many discussions, so I'm trying to be very careful how I word this. So,
No, I know where you stand on that, and there's probably a small fraction of a difference between the way you look at it and the way I look at it. I don't think that the United States is, what Israel was or God's kingdom or anything like that. My premise has always been that, I tremble sometimes at the way we have become because of the way we have committed our nation to the Lord. I think that after, the Lord's coming and Pentecost and all of that and the inclusion of Gentiles and in I don't know, the family, if you want to say it that way, that it's opened the door for Gentiles to cleanse themselves of the principalities that have operated in their lives. And I think that can operate on a personal level. I think it can operate on a corporate level in your business. I think it can operate on a multitude of levels. Um, but I think that if we fall away from that, that those old principalities that were in operation with Gentiles definitely reassert themselves, and that we're vulnerable in that sense. But as long as we walk in the ways that of God, then there's a lot of protection in that.
yeah, it's well, I think I mean, I grew up in an environment thinking, proud to be an American, and I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free. And and I am, and this is who I am. It is part of my identity. I mean, even though our culture is Swiss and German, there's a lot of similarities there. I'm not Swiss and I'm not German. I mean, I'm not a citizen there. I'm a citizen of the United States, even though culturally there's similarities. And I think that sometimes we look at that and we think of, we see Christian values in the country. And so we kind of identify with that. We say, well, that's what our country was founded on. That's why and so you assume there's a connection. But when you think about the legalities behind it, of the way God divided the nations and people, you're not dealing with. I guess it doesn't quite work that way. I look, it's a mystery. I'm not going to pretend like I understand because I really don't. I don't really understand how it works. Because in one sense, like you have this political flip-flopping going on, like in the United States, you've got these two strong ideologies in a two-party system, you know, fight duking out the politics for control of the people. So what does that mean? Is there two entities behind the Americas? Is this just is it what controls it? If Paul's view that all principalities, powers, and rulers of darkness are still in existence, is it so in America? Is it okay? Is there a righteous representative and an unrighteous representative over each government, and the people choose which side to go with? How does it work? What's the dynamic? Even the nature is, if God is sovereign and he allows nations to be corrupt, how does that work? All of those things come together in complexities that are very hard for us to understand as people, because it's hard for even as people to understand people. How hard is it for, me to understand everybody in my sphere, people that are around me that I I can't figure everybody out. Everybody's different. Everybody has their nuance. Everybody has their positions. Everybody has their angles. And I mean, look at why we have so many churches in the world, is because people have that many differences, and it's okay. I don't think it's a bad thing. Like when you consolidate, the only way to consolidate is with extreme power. You use the weapons that shame us all, or guilt, or whatever us into following a specific entity. So like in the backgrounds we were from, Kim's from a very power strong hierarchy, like the Amish, which they got that from the Catholics. So back in the day, the Catholics controlled, they were in governments. They controlled many of the Western, like from a ideological standpoint, they were right next to the king and controlled like empirically, if you will, were kind of the power behind the scene, which is where we get the idea of Christian countries. It took me a lot of years to try to understand what people meant by Christian countries. But if you think about back in the, Western Europe as a whole, these countries were highly connected through the Pope or through the papacy, and kind of created this peace, which was a kind of an extension of the Pax Romana. It was kind of this extension of the Roman Empire and the Roman peace. So, but yet that peace was only because of the consolidation of power and not
Right.
because of the religious liberty. It was, you will do it our way, or we will cut your heads off, or we will throw you in the Iron Maiden, or we will put you on the rack, or we will torture you, and we will excommunicate you, and you will not be able to buy and sell, and you will, and goes back to what it meant to be a Roman citizen. It's connected to that kind of historical reality. Like if you were a citizen, you get all these freedoms, and if you're not, you're out. And if you believe different, you're out. And then you get to America, and it's all these people fleeing. Well, each one has their own views, and they kind of set up their own strong hierarchies of, well, okay, now we are, then there's only several denominations to begin with, and then people break off of those because they become too tyrannical, too controlling, too, it just doesn't work. And yet on the other side is being too independent doesn't work. I mean, you got all these independent people, and a lot of people blame those people for not wanting to be under authority. They can just do whatever they want with no accountability. And that doesn't work either. So it's like I look at the whole thing and I'm just like, it's just a mess. It's just ever
Yeah.
evolving, changing of hierarchy, this changing of the guard from one side to the other, conservative to liberal to this to that. And is God really controlling all of this, or is he just letting it go? Well, and according to Deuteronomy 32, he's letting it go. He's got regional powers that are kind of running things, and it doesn't seem like he cares that much about that waffling going on in the nations. What he cares about is his ultimate narrative and getting Jesus back on the throne, and the burr in everybody's saddle from a nationalistic standpoint. If you think about the whole world, the entities have control of, they have kind of a control, okay? They have their own Pax Romana over the order of the world. And then you have this annoying little land blip in the middle of it all that you cannot find resolution over by anybody, and that's Israel. Like, there it is.
Right.
And why is it a problem? Because of the ideology. It's they have a right to the land because they got a book that's older than everybody else's of their family history. And even with a book that's older than anybody else's, that archaeology confers has some truth, right? Like there's toponyms, place names, archaeology that is found that supports the biblical reality. Okay, it isn't that all the stories in the Bible have been, that we found evidence for all the stories, but you talk about cities, places, time frames, things of that nature, there's truth there.
Right. Hmm.
Here you have a tribal book that proves they should be there, and the world just can't get their head wrapped around it. Like it's this burr, and you just can't settle the issue. There's no rest around it. All the nations are just, yeah. Then you have these other powers trying to fight it, and they just, it's,
Yeah, it's an ego problem, probably. We all want to be somebody, and we don't
well,
like being second rated to Israel.
but what's interesting, and it's not like Israel is a perfect country at all. There's all
Right.
kinds of problem with the government. Um, like when I say government, I mean, yeah, they're not believers. They're not like these aren't Christian folk. These are just like any other nation, full of sin and full of pride and full of whatever. But for
Right.
whatever reason, in the game of sovereignty, they are kind of like an anomaly that is very hard to deal with.
Yeah.
So it's anyway, we can draw this to a close. It's a very good discussion. Maybe we have to have a part two sometime of the
Maybe.
nature of how nations are operate. And um, yeah, I'm definitely not. I always try to like summarize it, I guess, for myself is that you've got one of two options. One is that God is very involved in government, and for whatever reason, if you're on the right, the right, if you're a rightist, you know, this is God sovereignly protecting our country, whatever. And then, okay, argument of sovereignty. Well, so the other leaders aren't sovereignly put into place. Well,
as judgment, perhaps.
and then the right one comes in. Oh, he's saving our country. Maybe he is. It might be, but what is the overarching hierarchy? Like, what is controlling it? If you think about the spirit of America, what is it? What is America? What does it represent? What is the entity behind it? We've chosen as our symbols very much a continuation of Roman ideology. So if you go to Washington D.C., Masonry, you've got symbols there representing our country that go back to I mean, we built temples to our leaders. We build temples to our ideology of freedom and liberty. And it is its own religion. It is, like it or not, we are this will get the buzzword going. We are a nation rooted in the Illuminati, in the Illumination movement that started in Europe of the liberty within us, the self light, which, if you really look at its roots, is not really biblical. But having said that, many of the people here had escaped religious persecution and they
Hmm.
just wanted to live their own lives. Like, we come from a sectarian group who wants nothing to do with government. I tend to think maybe they're onto something. I mean, yeah, it is interesting. Yeah, our kingdom is not of this world, and we just want to live our lives, and we don't want to get involved in global politics. Well, there's maybe some wisdom there. Maybe they know something I don't. All right, we'll just. Any final comments, Mr. Troyer?
Well, not really, except we never really got too much into the church part of it, which I kind of wanted to, but this is kind of a
Well, go
nuanced.
ahead. You
No,
got
no,
time.
we've taken it out long enough, I think.
Say
Well, I
charged.
mean, I, I guess I would just say that the movement we see in the church for unity, I would say ultimately is probably a good thing, and that what we
Like
see,
ecumenicalism.
no, I mean, I would also say that it's nuanced as well. I would say, no, what I mean is just the breaking down of barriers between denominations. And I would say that it's opening up an opportunity for sincere believers to actually have fellowship with each other. And but obviously then you run into ecumenicalism as well, where, there's a lot of, some of the similar things that go along with secular globalism, just the tolerance movement and all of that also kind of comes into play with the church as well. And that's obviously not a good thing either. Um, but ultimately, I would say that the movement as a whole is a good thing, fraught with its own dangers and challenges. But I just find it interesting that we have these two movements running parallel with each other, God with his own plan on one side, and, in my view, the enemy with his plan on the other side. But we don't have to flesh that out in great detail since we've run an hour and a quarter already.
2 hour episode. Well, let's bring that up in the next episode. We can dive into, I guess, the church and how it's structured. Again, I have my own very strong opinions on that, and I think I'll just give you a snippet of my theory. It goes back to the whole empirical mentality. Like it or not, humans love building kingdoms. We are masters at building domains, and we do that in the name of whatever we want. Okay, if you're each culture has its own deity, so they build in the name of the deity. But one of the things about the kingdom that Jesus will bring is that he will bring it. So when it comes, he is bringing the kingdom with him. He is bringing
Right.
the domain, the power, the manifestation of results. What we're here to do is represent that kingdom. And I think what people get mixed up is that they try to tie it that we are building it, like we are building God's kingdom. It's People have tried that ever since the dawn of time to build kingdoms for the gods, and it doesn't ever work. But if God builds it, it will never vanish. But if we build it, it's corruptible. All right, I'll leave it right there. So, okay. Well, yeah, we'll talk about the next time. It's a good subject. Well, thank
Okay,
you
very good.
everybody for listening. If you've listened through this far, we thank you for that. We love comments. Of course, keep them cordial. I delete the ones that are nasty. Well, they don't get that many, but we get occasionally get nasty ones. But if you got questions for us, you can just comment in the section below. And by all means, subscribe if you haven't. We love subscribers, and the algorithm wants more people. So please connect. All right, have a good one.